I can think exactly when it was. First, when singing in the choir through music, and God has been calling me ever since in many of the things I do, whether it's activities in the community or through music.
It was one of those weird things. First of all, it was my mum. My mum kind of said to me, "Oh, I think you'll be a vicar," and that was the most crazy idea for me. And a couple of weeks later, I had a bit of a vision that brought those words together. And my friend who had said, "You'll know what God wants you to do and it will scare you but excite you." And a vision of me as a parish priest. It was terrifying, but it was really affirming.
It was a long process. I'd say it was more like a small nagging voice that wouldn't go away, an itch that no matter how hard I scratched, wouldn't go. So it took a while before I got round to actually acknowledging that something was happening.
The first time I heard God calling me, I was a child in church, and it was sort of through my own thoughts in a way. I remember looking at the priest and thinking I could do that, which was a strange thing for a little girl to think in the 1980s when girls couldn't. But those feelings never really went away, and it kept coming back through my life.
I've heard God call me in all sorts of ways, mainly through prayer, but to ordination has been through the encouragement of other people, and actually embarking on the discernment process itself was the way of confirming that call, really.
Approximately about 7 years ago, I started feeling an intense call within me, sort of intense feeling, and I wasn't sure what it is. But I started getting these ideas that I need to go and become an ordained minister within the Church of England. And to be honest with you, I wasn't sure at that time because I was new to my church, I was new to Church of England, and I kind of brushed it off. But later, as time went on, people started coming over to me and saying things like, "Have you ever considered, this ordination path? Try it. We've seen you preaching, we've seen you interacting with people, you should be good at it."
God called me really through my involvement in church and through serving in church. A number of other people went forward for ordination from our church, and I guess I felt a little bit overlooked, or I felt a little bit, well, if them, then maybe me. But it was really confirmed when I went on a retreat, and the person leading the retreat, looking at vocations, took me on one side and said, "You now move." So that was a real confirmation for me, and from there the discernment process really accelerated. I remember going into work on the Monday morning and getting out of the car and bursting into tears. So I got back into the car and I just sorted myself out, thought, what was all that about? And when I got home that night, my wife said, "I think you're grieving. I think you've worked for 25 years in the health service and now God is calling you onto something else."
I think the biggest thing that I've learned about God is actually He calls people where they're at, and He calls the people as they are. I started training thinking that I was going to shed off lots of the things that I'd gathered along the way, but actually I realised God was calling me to be who I was, and that was all of those things.
I think two things really. Firstly, life can be difficult, it can be stressful, it can be hard at times. And really in all of that I found God just to be incredibly faithful. God is always there. And the other thing, Pope Benedict talks about Christianity not just being a set of lofty ideals or theories, but more so it's an encounter with a living God. And that's got to be true. I mean, when we encounter God, it changes things. And for me, that's my experience.
Partly that he's got a sense of humour, but more specifically that he is probably a lot more interested in the journey that we're on than the destination that we sometimes focus on, I think.
Well, firstly, I've learned about God that God has a sense of humour. I usually say to people, look at me. Can you imagine? I'm getting ordained in 3 months' time now. God certainly has a sense of humour. And I usually turn it as a joke, or to a joke. But to be honest, it's true. There is lots of truth in that. Because I often feel I'm different. I mean, everyone is different, but I'm different.
Two things. First thing, you can't ignore God. When God wants your attention, He's going to get your attention. And secondly, the most important one I think is that God doesn't always call the obvious, which is something I struggled with, that I'm not really vicar material.
He's persistent, but he loves everybody, actually. Some of those years when I was ignoring him, I was perhaps not behaving as one would expect a future priest to behave. And he still wanted me, and he still kept coming for me, kept nudging me.
I've learned that God is bigger than we think he is, that he responds to all his children when they come to him in whatever way.
Probably that you can run but you can't hide, that God's very constant, that God stays with you, and that God is full of surprises actually. I had no idea all that time ago when I started my training of the journey that I would have been on, and the directions that would have taken me. God is amazing.